Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present, and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore sea level rise and its implications for coastal areas, including cities like Boston, with our distinguished guests this evening. I am now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Baylor Fox-Kemper is Professor of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University. He is a physical oceanographer and climate modeler specializing in the representation of turbulent and wave processes in our climate system. He serves as a coordinating lead author of Chapter 9, Ocean, Cryosphere, and Sea Level Change, in the recent 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Courtney Humphries is an award-winning journalist and author who writes about ideas and developments in science, nature, and the built environment. She has served as a public research fellow at the Norman P. Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library, and as a Knight Fellow at MIT. She just recently, as of Monday, defended her dissertation in environmental sciences at UMass Boston, researching waterfront infrastructure history and future climate adaptation. Paul Kirshen is Professor of Climate Adaptation in the School for the Environment at UMass Boston and Director of the Stone Living Lab. He has more than 40 years of experience serving as Principal Investigator of complex interdisciplinary participatory research related to water resources, coastal zone and infrastructure management, and climate variability and change. He was a lead author of the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, working on water resources in North America, and the 2014 US National Climate Assessment on Coastal Zone. Sanjay Seth is the Climate Resilience Program Manager for the City of Boston, where he manages the Climate Ready Boston program in collaboration with a wide range of partners, as well as other projects that address climate change impacts and protect the health and well-being of all residents and communities in Boston. Previously, he worked to develop long-range plans for multi-billion-dollar investments to protect New York City from the impacts of climate change. The Reverend Vernon K. Walker is Senior Program Manager at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CREW. His wide-ranging service to the community includes work on several nonprofit board of directors and advisory boards. Throughout his time in Boston, he has frequently commented on his work related to social justice in the local media and has also spoken on his work at numerous universities across the country. I'm also delighted to welcome to the library virtually our moderator for this evening. Barbara Moran is a correspondent on WBUR's environmental team. For 25 years, she has worked as a science journalist covering public health, environmental justice, and the intersection of science and society. She has served as a Knight Fellow at MIT and was twice awarded the National Association of Science Writers' highest honor, Science in Society Award. Please join me in welcoming our special guests. Over to you, Barbara.
Hey, thank you so much and welcome everybody. I'm really excited about this panel tonight because the expertise spans so many areas. You know, we have international experts and very local experts and people who know about history. So it's great. We're going to cover everything. So to start off, I wanted to go to Baylor, since you wrote the chapter, as was mentioned in your introduction, on the recent UN report about sea level rise. And I was wondering if you could start out just by grounding us, and grounding the audience in what we know about sea level rise now. Where does the scientific knowledge stand?
Sure. I thought, I selected a few sentences to begin from the report that I thought would be useful to kind of set the stage. And then some folks may be wondering, there was a new report that actually just came out last week. So I'll drag one piece out of that report as well. So here's starting with those. It's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. Human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that's unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Global mean sea level rose faster since 1900 than over any prior century in at least the last 3,000 years. The thermal expansion explains about half of sea level rise. So that's when the ocean gets warmer, it expands. While the other major contributor is when ice on land melts or when ponds drain and add that water to the ocean. One alarming change, recent change, is that the rate of ice sheet loss, so Greenland and Antarctica, has increased by a factor of 4 between 1992 to 1999 and 2010 to 2019. So the change has quadrupled in the recent decade. And then that most recent report, the key sea level rise piece that I think is relevant for the conversation tonight, is that risks from sea level rise for coastal ecosystems and people are very likely to increase tenfold well before 2100 without adaptation and mitigation action, as agreed by the parties to the Paris Agreement. So folks have heard about the Paris Agreement. Adaptation and mitigation are what they're working on, and the risks are substantial, a tenfold increase in risks before 2100, and that's in most places. And we can discuss in detail Boston later, but I actually would put Boston's risks as higher than that, higher than the global average.
Great. Okay, we will get to that. How come we're never lower than the global average in these risks? One other thing I wanted to just touch on about these reports that came out, and there's also a recent report out from NOAA a couple weeks ago that basically confirmed all this, was that basically we're looking at a certain amount of sea level rise that's kind of locked in by 2050 or so. And can you just tell us what are we looking at around here? Like 2 inches? Are we looking at 10 inches? Are we looking at 10 feet? What do you think we're looking at?
So let's jump down to really the Boston scale. So the Boston projections from the IPCC for 2030 versus like 2005. So what's the difference for 10 years from now from a little bit ago, is a 17 centimeter sea level rise. So, that's like this big, which doesn't seem all that much. But it doesn't depend at all on whether it's a low emission scenario or a high emission scenario. It's 17 centimeters across the board. When we go out to 2050, it's 31 centimeters to 37 centimeters, which is now starting to get about a foot. And that is a small range of variation across the scenarios. So still, there's not much we can do by reducing emissions to avoid that. But when we get out to 2100 or 2150, then it starts being double at the high emissions levels. So part of it's locked in the near term. In the next 20 to 30 years, we're in for some sea level rise. And we know pretty well what those numbers are, at least what the range is. When we look farther out toward the end of the century and into next century, that's when the spread starts to occur.
Right.
So the reduction in emissions will help us avoid the worst in the future, but they're not going to stop sea level rise in its tracks. And that's really because the oceans and cryosphere are slow to respond to, it takes a long time for the ocean to warm up and expand, especially the deep ocean. It takes a long time for those massive ice sheets, continent size pieces of ice, to melt. So even melting a small fraction takes a long time. So that's why there's this inertia in the system already in sea level.
Okay, so 30-ish centimeters by 2050, which is what in English? What's 30 centimeters in English? Like
30 centimeters, so it's a third of a meter, so it's about a foot.
About a foot,
what we're
okay.
talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so Boston folks, so what does that actually look like in Boston? We'll use Boston as an example. I mean, does that look like flooding every time there's a high tide, or does it look like just increased storm water flooding? I mean, what kind of impacts do we see from that in Boston, or what are we seeing already, and what are we looking at the next couple decades? Who wants to take it first? Sanjay, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. So, what we see today during like a very high tide is we see flooding at places like Long Wharf, which is kind of a low-lying historic area in the downtown. We see flooding at Morrissey Boulevard, a couple parts of East Boston. The flooding that we see is mostly just water lapping the shores, kind of hinting at what's to come. And what we see with 20 inches of sea level rise, or in this case, a foot of sea level rise, will be just more of that, of this kind of
20 centimeters, right? Not 20 inches.
Yeah. Well, in terms of 2050, what we look at in Boston is a little bit different in terms of our projections. But that's ours are a little more risk averse. But that's to say, what we'll see is more of that kind of flooding, right? There are flood pathways, things where there are low-lying places in the city of Boston where we have filled land. And they're kind of these little valleys in the middle of the kind of inland areas of Boston. And those are the little mini tipping points that exist throughout the city that once you kind of hit that elevation, all of a sudden the ocean just wants to flow to that spot because it's low-lying. And so what we do in the city of Boston, in the Climate Ready Boston program, is we look at all of these flood pathways that enter the city of Boston over the next 50 years, and how do we close them in time to make sure that we're not hitting those little mini tipping points that let water deep into the inland areas of Boston.
Okay. Vernon, Paul, do you want to add anything about sort of what sea level rise looks like in Boston to you guys right now, or what are you looking at sort of on the ground?
I might just add that if we do have 1 foot of sea level rise, which we seem to be on track for 2050, it means the so-called 100-year event, which has a probability of being equal or exceeding any 1 year of 1%, occurs in the average once every 100 years. With 1 foot of sea level rise, that same event will occur once in the average every 10 years. So an event that is probabilistically not very frequent becomes relatively frequent. So for example, in Boston, we had in early 2018, 2 so-called 100-year events. And that caused a great deal of flooding in East Boston. It flooded the Aquarium T station around Long Wharf. Well, an event like that is going to occur on the average once every 10 years now, instead of once every 100 years. And then, of course, the 100-year event is going to be a lot larger than it is now as well. So it's definitely going to change the dynamics of living on the coast, 1 foot sea level rise.
Vernon, anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that the time is now for humanity to prepare for more extreme weather as it becomes more frequent, more deadly, and more dangerous. We've heard it here so far about how sea level is going to continue to rise. And essentially, for people that live in low-lying areas, and they will experience more extreme flooding. And what we do at Crew, or part of what we do, is we help people make emergency preparedness kits. Because really, fundamentally, the mission of Crew is climate resilience is social resilience. So essentially, when we're helping people make kits, which are in the form of book bags, they have first aid kits, waterproof matches, floods, flashlights rather, a flashlight, and a water document protector to protect vital documents, because as it is clear that this will continue to happen at greater scope and deeper intensity. So simply put, we know that climate change is universal, but the impacts are disproportionately felt by environmental justice communities. Someone mentioned earlier Dorchester, and we know that Dorchester is an environmental justice community. It's also a community that faces urban heat islands. Although this event is centering on urban heat islands, it is certainly another effect of the extreme weather that we are seeing. So I think this is really a warning that we need mitigation, and we need mitigation efforts, and we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, coal, and gas. However, and consequently, because climate change has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, we still need to prepare, because sea level inevitably is going to continue to rise. Heat waves are going to inevitably become increasingly more hot, longer, and deadly. So I think this certainly is a wake-up call for those who are in the Boston area, about which is surrounded by water, and also to those who live in other cities, Miami, for instance, that coastal flooding is real.
I wanted to talk a little more about Boston and what makes Boston particularly unique and susceptible, as Baylor was hinting at before. And Courtney, I know this is your area of expertise. Could you talk a little bit about sort of Boston's unique landfilling history and why that makes us susceptible to sea level rise?
Yeah, so I mean, every city, every urban area, I think, has risks that are not just based on what's going to happen with the climate, but also based on how they developed and what their development patterns are, and their sort of history, you know, the baggage that they bring into it. And so I think Boston, that's definitely the case, where you see that if you look at any of the flood maps, you know, future projections of flooding, it really maps very closely to the land that was created over time. And Boston, you know, has like 1/6 of the land in Boston is built on fill. So it has this history of expansion that I think is really unique about, and is really a fundamental part of the city.
Can you describe, because people may not be actually familiar with how Boston was like built and what built on fill means? Because when it started, it was just this like little neck with a blob on the end, and now it had nothing. It didn't look anything like it looks today.
Yeah, well, the whole area was very watery and had a lot of mud flats and tidal marshes around it. And Boston was really a little peninsula sticking out into that, with a little bit of land connecting it, a little bridge of land connecting it to the mainland. And at the time, it was a great place to have a port because it was, you know, kind of stuck out into the harbor, and was a good place, you know, for ships to land. But you know, over time, there were all these decisions made that expanded out into all of those shallows around Boston and all the mud flats. And it started out as a way to kind of expand Boston as a port, because it didn't really have a lot of natural docking sites and that would reach out into the deep water channels. And so the colonial government actually, you know, passed a law giving people the right to own land out into the tidal areas, which was kind of different from the English tradition, had that was like a common resource. So they let private people own land, own tidelands, basically. And that really was trying to encourage people to build wharves and docks and things like that out into the water. And then you just see over time, it just kind of balloons out, where there's a whole shoreline developed full of wharves, of all these little private wharves and all these little structures. And then gradually over time, those started to get filled in. And then later in the 19th century, you saw these larger fill projects, which people are often familiar with, like the filling of Back Bay, and then filling of South Boston Flats, which created the seaport, and then all around East Boston. It went into the 20th century with like the Logan Airport area, which is huge. So it kind of started out with all these little fingers of wharves and things all around the waterfront, and then it grew into these bigger projects. And it really there were a lot of, like, East Boston was islands, so it really changed the way that the this, the whole area around Boston looked.
Well, why does that history make it susceptible to sea level rise? Because I guess
Yeah, well,
Phil could be, high up, right? I mean,
yeah, so it's just that because no one wanted to fill higher than they needed to, because it's a lot of resources. The first fill projects often came from actually flattening some of the hills in Boston, so we would have had more high ground if we hadn't flattened those hills. And then later projects took fill from other parts, outside of Boston and train, took it on trains in, and then it started using dredged material from the harbor, and which is whatever they could use. But it was, it's that kind of material is always like expensive and difficult, and so people really just filled just to where they needed to get above, above the tides or above, a reasonable storm flood. And so that we just have a lot of low-lying land, and it's, like as Sanjay said, there's areas where it was just a little bit filled in that make these flood pathways, but you also have like the seaport, which was a huge expanse of just flat fill. And so that, that area is like very, will be very flood prone in the future because it is just so large and flat.
Right. It's already flood prone now, as we remember from the storms a couple of years ago. I mean, I think remember people kayaking in the streets down there, and everybody remembers the dumpster floating along down on Seaport Boulevard. I think that was. So I feel like, yeah, we already see hints of it in a way, right? On occasion. So we also have Boston, I think, this combination. So we have sea level rise, we have this very low lying land, and also being on the coast, and susceptible to storms and storm surge. And this seems like part of what makes us especially vulnerable. Can somebody just talk to us about that and that combination? And have we seen it? Is that what happened in 2018? Was it that sort of that combination of factors sort of flooding Boston? And is that what we're going to be seeing more of too?
So the storm surge part, a key example that I think of when I think about storm surge and damage is Superstorm Sandy, which caused an enormous amount of damage at the places when it hit land at high tide, and much less damage when it hit places not at high tide, a little bit later in the storm. So that damage pattern really is the combination of those effects. So when you have a storm, the wind can push the water up against the coastline, and actually the low pressure at the center of the storm lifts the water up as well. Those combine to make added water on top of the sea level, whatever it would be without the storm. So that's the storm surge. And then of course there are waves riding on top of that, and the waves may do more damage by overtopping coastal features. So you put all that together, and that's the compound effect. And then there are other sort of interesting effects. Those are true of all places along the coast, but Boston, and Rhode Island as well are subject to these big hurricanes. Hurricanes are energized by warm water underneath them. As the water gets warmer, those storms get stronger. Nor'easters as well have a similar effect. And then finally, when the Gulf Stream changes, it actually brings us a local sea level rise aspect here. As the Gulf Stream slows, the sea level rises here in response. And there's a special kind of gravitational effect to do with Antarctica that also kind of puts a bullseye right on Boston, which is, a longer thing to say, but there are a lot of things going against us here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island from a sea level perspective.
Oh my God, even Antarctica is against us. Wow. Okay. So tell me about, because, I have to say, even though like I'm a climate reporter and I cover this all the time, we talk about like, flooding in Mercy Boulevard and blah, 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 little funny. It's like, it sounds like an inconvenience, it sounds like that's kind of a pain, whatever. I just won't go that way today. I don't know. So can some of the city folks talk about some of the effect, like the more worrisome things that you're worried about with sea level rise or thinking about looking ahead? Like it's
what keeps
smiling.
us up at night? I'm smiling because I think so sea level rise, what am I worried about in Boston? Like we have effects today, right? I don't want to give the impression that small fringe flooding at Morrissey doesn't have an effect. It has the effect of actually damages of, millions of dollars worth of people's time to detour around that area. Or, we had floods in 2010 that affected the Green Line in an MBTA tunnel with significant millions of dollars of damage. We've seen, flooding have an impact on basic operations, getting to people, making sure they're safe. There's so much that's happening today that kind of hints at what we're going to, but what we're going to, if we don't act, is some significant sea level rise and major storm events that really question some of the basic history. To Courtney's point, how we've developed as a city really positions us to lead on climate adaptation, but also we have to. It's not really a choice for Boston. It's kind of a must do, because by 2070, Boston plans for about 40 inches of sea level rise, which is consistent with NOAA's high curve estimate. But when you go from 2070 to 2100, 2070 gets you your first meter of sea level rise. Within 30 years, you're at your second meter of sea level rise. Within another 30 years, you're at your third meter of sea level rise, at least just on the NOAA high curve with the stuff that just came out recently. So what we're seeing is the pace of adaptation, if we don't get our emissions under control, really goes beyond what cities typically do for their infrastructure policy. Even cities that are at the forefront, like Boston, New York, Miami, San Francisco, it's a very challenging pace to meet. And that's why adaptation in a lot of ways just shows the incredible value of mitigation. In addition to the urgent work we need to do around adaptation, it just shows you that there's no either or. It's just, what we need to do, and we haven't met the pace yet as a world and as a country on really making sure we're reducing our emissions. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. So on that, I'm trying to think. I have so many questions. I was wondering if you guys, since you all think about sea level rise a lot, tell me about other adaptations you've seen from cities similar to Boston, elsewhere in the United States or the world, that you think are a good way to go, or like a really sort of interesting thing that we should be thinking about, maybe not in Boston, but elsewhere. Sanjay, you want to go again? Because you're thinking about it, and then let everybody else a chance to think of their favorite.
Sure. Yeah, happy to go. So Boston works with cities across the country and across the world to share ideas. And sometimes things really make sense in Boston, sometimes they don't. A lot of Boston's work focuses on raising the coastal edge and making sure that we're protecting from, just keeping the ocean out, right? While improving kind of quality of life for people, improving our parks and access to the waterfront. In other areas, people take all sorts of approaches, right? In London, for instance, they have a major feature that crosses the Thames and like closes down and blocks out flooding. I think in New Haven as well. In some places they actually just
like a floodgate.
Yeah, in some places they use floodgates. In some places they actually just say, hey, why fight the ocean? Let's move over here. In some places, they take different, they just like elevate. Like in Louisiana, you see a lot of people just raise the houses, but not necessarily try to keep the water out. So it really depends upon how you've developed, what your funding is, what your governance is. It's a very complex task to do adaptation. So there's a lot of different factors that influence what people choose to do.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite adaptations involve letting the natural system do what it would like to do. And so salt marshes and oyster reefs are good examples of things that will help dampen that storm surge and wave effect, and thereby protect stuff behind it without hardening. The problem with hardening, like building higher seawalls, is if you build a higher seawall behind a beach, if that beach wants to retreat, which it might naturally, it has nowhere to go. So there's this coastal squeeze phenomenon that was featured in the last IPCC report last week, where the natural features are getting pushed up against the hardened infrastructure. And so we end up losing the natural access to the shoreline, even though we maybe are protecting structures behind that seawall. So some natural adaptation techniques can get you a little better toward that. And, a managed retreat or keeping a recreational area near the water is a good way to go, because when it's not flooding, you can use it. When it is flooding, it's naturally resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that the IPCC UN report last week, man, seawall's got a big smackdown in that. I'll say we could talk a little more about that in a minute. But is there anybody else who have some things that you think have worked elsewhere that you think are really innovative or interesting that might work here? Or conversely, things that you've seen like, well, that didn't work. Maybe we won't do that over here. Anyone else want to
Actually, could we go back a little bit to impacts? Everything on the coast can be impacted, whether it's a built, natural, or human system. And as Baylor pointed out, we want to preserve our natural coastal systems as much as we can. And in Boston, we have two major marsh systems. One is in Belle Isle Marsh in East Boston, and one is in the Neponset system. Unless we can help them, build up and migrate because of sea level rise, they're just going to turn to open bodies of water. Mm-hmm. We're going to lose all their ecosystem benefits and flood protection benefits. So I think it's really important that we're sensitive to the impacts on the natural environment as well. The other thing is, and we're all aware of this, is the distributional impacts of climate change are unequal. I mean, we know that populations that have been marginalized and oppressed, they're going to suffer more because they're living in areas that are more flood prone. So, parts of East Boston and Dorchester are classic examples of these EJ communities that are right in the present flood pathways, let alone future flood pathways. And these communities have what we call the least adaptive capacity to adapt to the changes. And essentially, the wealthy are going to be able to buy their way out of climate change. But lower income groups, they can't move. They are locked in. And so I think the city and is obviously very aware of this. I think all the panel members here are very aware of it. But it's always going to be an important consideration is the equity aspects of climate change. And of course, these populations have had probably the least to do with climate change. Mm-hmm. I mean, they've had the lowest carbon footprint. And this is true not only in Boston and the US, but also globally. Those that are the least carbon footprint, like those on small island developing states, the SIDS, least contribution to the climate change problem, but they're suffering the most. So it's this huge equity problem. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I have a couple, when we get back to talking about examples of adaptation, I have a couple of examples, but we might want to talk a little bit more about the impacts here.
I was going to just be looping off that, Vernon, it sounds like what your group is trying to do a lot of is sort of build that awareness and that social resiliency in EJ communities. And can you just talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that you're doing and what you're hearing from people? Like when you try to do this, like when you go out and talk about, here's a flood emergency kit, or people like, oh, cool. Or people like, what are you talking about? I don't need a flood emergency kit. Or what's the reaction from people?
Well, I like to lift up to piggyback on what Paul talked about, the unequal impacts that various communities face from the climate crisis. I want to lift up something that really drives the work of CREW, and then I'll provide an example. So in 1995, there was a Chicago heat wave, and there was a book written about this Chicago heat wave. It was 5 days over 95-degree temperature. The name of the book is called Heat Wave: A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. The author is Eric Klingenberg, and he went by, who's a sociologist, he went and did a block by block analysis of this heat wave. And his research concluded that the neighbors that were connected to each other were less likely to die and to suffer than those who weren't. And unfortunately, 739 people died in a horrendous fashion because of a 5-day heat wave that was atrocious and just mind-blowing. So now coming back up to 2022, where we are, and essentially what we have done as crew. In the last few years, prior to the pandemic and also during the pandemic, is we show maps. We have particular maps that show flood projections in our PowerPoint. So essentially, a lot of our presentations have been virtual because there are two ways in which we try to reach out to communities through education and service. So when we do our education component, and we work with a lot of community-based organizations, and we come and they invite us in, we show our presentations countrywide, actually, and depending on who we're talking to and what city the residents are situated in, we have a PowerPoint for that. We have regional PowerPoints for where people are. Coming back to Boston, so as we mentioned, Boston is very flood prone, and we show the predictions of how there will be frequent flooding, and at the end we show the book bag, and people, the reflection that we're seeing is people didn't know how serious this thing can be. And really, essentially, one of the things we're trying to do is underscore the gravity of sea level rise and heat waves and snowstorms. And one other thing that we don't really talk about is tick-borne illnesses. As the planet is warming up, unfortunately, we're going to see mosquitoes that are vectors that carry malaria come over to the Western Hemisphere. And essentially, we try to show what these different impacts are. But to answer your question succinctly, which is as much brevity as I can, I think people, the response that I see and my colleagues see is people just are like shocked and really thought about how serious flooding and sea level rise is. And oftentimes we run across folks who provide comments to us and share comments during a question and answer that they think climate change is 90 years away, 80 years away, 50 years away. And then when we say, oh, we're experiencing this now, we're seeing what we're seeing right now. And it really is a aha moment and an epiphany, if you will.
Interesting. We have an audience question that's sort of following up on what the Reverend is saying about the city of Boston, and how is the city of Boston's urban planning taking this stuff into account, the heat waves, the flooding, and the other sort of threats that he's mentioning. So how, yeah, I guess, right. What is the city doing?
Perfect. I get to pitch Climate Ready Boston. Great. So the city since 2016 published Climate Ready Boston, which is kind of a citywide framework for how we prepare for climate change. And we've done detailed neighborhood by neighborhood coastal resilience plans to make sure we know what we need to build, where we need to build it, and by when, in order to make sure over the next 50 years, Boston is prepared and its residents can thrive in the face of climate change. So that those coastal resilience investments, right, there might be some that go earlier than others because of how, like Courtney said earlier, there are some places in Boston that are just super low and are at risk today. Like if we got a really bad storm today, we could see tens of millions of dollars of damage in Boston. And so we focus on some of those near-term pathways, then we do midterm, then eventually we'll do more of the long-term pathways. And in Boston, in total, we've already identified about 70 projects that we need to build at a total cost of around, $3 billion or so, to help kind of buy up some protection, raise the coastal edge, and make sure we can keep the water out. Now, when it comes to heat, so if we can talk about heat a little bit.
Can I just ask, like what kind of projects?
Yeah. So the projects always are very context dependent. Sometimes you're talking about a berm, which is just like a very organized pile of dirt that has maybe sometimes some kind of core wall to it. And that berm just raises the edge. You can put a pathway on top sometimes, but that keeps the water out from coming in. Sometimes you're talking about raising a road or raising a seawall, or thinking about other solutions, using our Harbor Walk system. The Harbor Walk, for folks not from Boston, is a track you can go across most of the harbor that lets you kind of have access to the waterfront. And there's ways to raise it. If you're in Boston, go to Langone and Popolo Park. You can see an example of raising the coastal edge, but still putting people's experience of the waterfront at the center. They get a chance to still be at the waterfront. We're not boxing out the waterfront, but we're actually improving it and adding a little bit of elevation, like stepped seating at Langone and Popolo Park that hides a little flood wall inside of it. So there's a lot of things you can do. You can be super creative, but ultimately it's all a matter of timing, elevation, and how much sea level rise we get. And those are things that we can know pretty well at this point. And they just drive home the need for action on climate mitigation, because the costs associated with adaptation across the entire country. You can only imagine if it's this costly in Boston, how costly it'll be in a place like New York City or Miami.
I was just gonna ask, what was that dollar amount you attached to all these projects? 70.
So
70
if we're keeping tabs on Boston's coastal resilience, we're currently at about 3 billion for some of it. We don't have all of the pieces costed out yet, but for the 70 projects we do have costed out, we're talking about around $3 billion. Now that's feasible in the grand scheme of federal spending, but for a city to go alone, that's impossible. So that's something we work very closely with our federal and state partners, with the private sector community, with nonprofit folks, to try to, in our academic community, to make sure that we can get this all set up in time. This is a city that's 400 years old. It has history in how it's built. And, if you want to get that next 100 years, that next 200 years, it's going to require an all of city approach. Yeah.
Well, not just all of city. And this touches on another question from the audience, because, sea level rises and it's the whole coast, right? I mean, and if we just sort of build up Boston, then we're just going to flood this towns to the north and the towns to the south, right? You're just pushing the water somewhere else, right? So I guess how do you coordinate? I guess how are you trying to coordinate across state boundaries or regional boundaries, or is that, I don't know, is that something that's not happening but should happen? And I don't know, Sanjay, if you're I don't know.
No, I can speak. I've just been speaking a lot. So if someone else wants to take it.
Yeah. Anybody else want to grab that one, the regional question, or is that?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, so there's a lot of processes to coordinate regionally, right? In many cities like Boston, there's often a nonprofit or a quasi-governmental organization that helps coordinate regionally. In the Boston region, it's the Metropolitan Area Planning Council that helps coordinate different conversations, knowledge sharing, sometimes does regional reports. There's also things like the Resilient Mystic Collaborative that does work to coordinate regionally. There's the Stone Living Lab that Paul's the director of, that develops all sorts of research that's relevant at a regional scale. Sometimes there's flood pathways in East Boston near the Belle Isle Marsh. There's a flood pathway that enters in both through Revere and through Boston. And so there's no world in which we can adapt without thinking about the region, right? There's no city can go it alone, right? We're all in a connected metropolitan region. So there's a lot of opportunities. We have tons of meetings to coordinate as a region, both formally and informally, on heat, on stormwater, on coastal risk. There's watershed associations that coordinate at regional scales. Mystic Charles and Neponset Watershed Association. So there's a lot of different elements that pull this together, but obviously we don't have a regional government, and there's different leadership from city, from kind of regional, from state, from federal, that can all get to this kind of, how is this rising tide where all boats are rising, versus kind of the cities with the greatest real estate value are protected, but other cities are left to think about relocation.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So that's where I was going to go next, and about the big MR question that nobody wants to talk about, which is managed retreat, which is, for folks who aren't familiar with that term, it's this, this question that some coastal areas are starting to ask is, when do we decide that it's better for, people to not be living or building or working in an area, and to move away from that area. And so some parts of the United States are already doing this. Some parts of the world are already doing this. We'll just bring it outward from Boston for a second. And can someone talk a little bit about some of the discussion nationwide going on about managed retreat in other cities that you've seen, and some of the conflicts that are emerging there?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about Rhode Island, which is quite different from Boston. So Rhode Island, there's a hurricane barrier in Providence, and natural hills surrounding Providence. So Providence is quite well protected for a long time.
You didn't chop down all your hills like Boston did. Good work, Providence.
And Newport is, has the high cliffs of the cliff walk, so it is also quite protected. And so we think, oh, great. But many of the other cities, Central Falls, Barrington, Warwick, many of them with substantial EJ communities are not protected. And so that's a key aspect of how we think about this and how we go forward. And there actually have been some neighborhoods that have had managed retreat already in Rhode Island. And it starts out as this nuisance flooding becomes a little bit more than a nuisance. And one of the big problems with that is, so if your basement floods once every 100 years, you don't care. If it floods every 10 years, maybe you do something about it. If it floods every year, now you're getting into where you may start getting mold and other pieces and your property values plummet. So even before your house is constantly underwater, our capitalist society will change the system out from underneath you. So a really critical part of managed retreat has to be environmental justice. It doesn't make sense without it. They really need to be linked together. And so we shouldn't be doing managed retreat from only the neighborhoods who can afford to, and not the neighborhoods who can't, or something like that. So it is a very difficult community values question and governmental challenge to do that in a way that's equitable. And that's true in all the states that are worrying about this. There are lots of fights about all kinds of things that are going on in lots of different states, but it is a big challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. Anybody else want to add to that question about the management?
I was going to add that we just talked about regional issues. I think retreat has to be looked at also regionally, because people are going to be moving from these low-lying communities inland. And so there's going to be some cooperation about how we're going to move these populations inland to higher areas and how that's going to happen. I've heard that in parts of like Florida, around Miami, property values are really increasing a lot in the higher elevation areas. And unfortunately, right now in those higher elevation areas, we have a lot of low-income people who are being forced out. And so it's as Baylor pointed out, it's all to be looked at through the lens of environmental justice. The other thing is, as Baylor also pointed out, retreat is sort of the natural progression. Like, first of all, we can accommodate the flooding, then we try to protect ourselves, then eventually we have to retreat. So it's going to happen eventually, pretty much every sort of coastal area, particularly a low place like Boston. And the question is it becomes unmanaged, it becomes very expensive and inequitable. And in a place like Norfolk, Virginia, they've actually laid out in their Vision 2100 areas of the city that they aren't going to protect. So if you live in that area of the city, you're going to have to retreat eventually. But they're thinking, okay, where are these people going to go? So through a bunch of interaction, they know most people want to stay in the area. So they're thinking now in certain parts of Norfolk that are higher, they're going to densify them. They're going to increase the density of those areas. So people that move away from the coast don't have to move to another state or another town. They can move to a more denser part of Norfolk. But that's got to be thought out beforehand. They've got to change the zoning to allow the densification. So I think in a place like Boston, we can think about like East Boston. We may have to be making the hill area of East Boston denser than it is now. So those people can move up the hill into different areas and still have their housing. But it's a tricky question.
It is tricky.
We all have attachment to where we live.
And
I was
if
just
I can jump in.
yeah.
So currently at Crew, we're working with the Charles River Watershed Association. Watershed associations were mentioned earlier. And the Charles River Watershed Association serves 35 municipalities along the Charles River watershed. And we're working together to bring valuable resources and tools to community members to help prepare for flooding. And we are learning directly from residents, especially people from within environmental justice and climate vulnerable communities, about their experiences with flooding, how they respond, and what additional strategies could help strengthen their response. And what has made this possible is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness grant program in Massachusetts. And for those who aren't familiar, it's a program that allows municipalities across the Commonwealth to assess their vulnerability to the threats of climate change. So we've been blessed to be able to work with the Charles River Watershed Association 2 years in a row. And we're also working with Weston and Sampson, and they're doing flood projections. So we've organized countless of meetings along the Charles River, virtual meetings that is, for residents to come from different towns, upper watershed, middle watershed, lower watershed, and to understand, these are the future impacts, and also to discuss strategies. So we're really excited about that work, and that work we're engaged in even as we speak right now. One of my colleagues is leading that from the crew side of things. And it's certainly never a dull moment. And essentially, when it was mentioned about this regional approach, I think we also have to look at statewide, 350 towns in Massachusetts. How are cities coordinating regionally and even across the state? And we found that the MVP report that various cities have done can help residents in those communities learn about the threats that they're expected to face if they continue to live in that community, in that city.
Vernon, when you bring this information to people and they're sort of surprised at the threats, did any of them bring up the idea of moving out or leaving, or ask if there are programs, that would help them move out if they wanted to? And are there any managed retreat programs in the works in Greater Boston or in no, nothing, Sanjay Seth said, or Massachusetts? Do people ever ask you about that, Vernon, or is that not there yet? Is that not a question yet?
I haven't heard that feedback, but I can share an experience. One time we were doing a presentation in Brighton, and we were talking about the different flood projections in Boston. And Brighton is on like high ground, and if you notice that Brighton doesn't flood. And one resident in Brighton raised the question, well, will a lot of people in Boston be moving to Brighton then? Because these other areas could be underwater, and Back Bay and all these other all these different communities could flood consistently. So the answer to the question that you raised, from my experience, is I was talking to people that live on like the highland or higher area in the city of Boston, and we were doing a presentation, and residents were concerned or asking a genuine question of, well, will everyone just come move here?
That's so interesting. So it's like, oh, I actually live on a hill, and are we going to get like pushed out by climate gentrification or whatever, right? Because we're all like sort of running for the hills.
Can I add to that too? Just that I think I'm glad that Paul brought up like the Norfolk, Virginia idea, and the fact that they're kind of thinking about zoning as a way of preparing, adapting to climate change. And I feel like that conversation, really doesn't happen here. I have heard, several years ago, I heard a proposal, I think it was Alan Berger at MIT, who kind of had presented an idea for kind of zoning around the city for resilience, for some areas being upzoned if they're higher, and some areas being sort of downzoned and then gradually transformed over time as they became flooded. And I feel like that kind of, it's a difficult political conversation. So, but it's an interesting idea because I think the way the strategy that Boston has really taken is to kind of build our way out, and if you look at Imagine Boston 2030, it says, we recognize, identifies several growth areas in the city that they want to grow. And it says, we recognize that these are like 4 out of 5 of these are in flood zones, but we're committing, by building there, we're committing to protecting them. And so it's sort of like, we're going to keep developing and building there, but we're going to plan all this protection. And so I think that the issue with Boston is that it's been very good at the what, like we have all these beautiful designs, and as Sanjay said, we have like all these projects, but it's the how, it's like the how to pay for it, how to plan it, who's responsible for it. That's a tricky problem. And so I think, I think it's worth talking about whether, we are putting more people and more infrastructure in sites of risk, without, necessarily knowing how it's all going to be protected and how long it's going to be protected and stuff. So I think it's, it would be really difficult I don't see a lot of, upzoning conversations happening in Boston, but it would be interesting to hear that.
And I think Sanjay made an excellent point before, talking about the sea level is getting faster and faster, accelerating. When we look out not just decades, but centuries, maybe on the time scale that you might think under some kind of very sophisticated future vision of Boston, the numbers are much, much bigger, not in centimeters and meters. And so the concept from last week's report was you might do something in the near term that avoids thinking about the longer term in a deep way. So they talk about transformational adaptation, where you're not fixing today's problem that lasts for a year, and sometimes fixing today's problem, as in the example right there about adding development to flood-prone areas, might be causing bigger problems in the future, rather than thinking about a little bit longer term to when those protections won't be there anyway, and maybe thinking, well, we could do it for 30 years, but not for 50. Is that really where we want to build? That those kind of conversations are hard, but there are lots of studies showing that actually ends up optimizing the choice making overall. If you think ahead with, on multiple times and multiple risks that are coming. Especially like as in the case of sea level rise, where the projections are quite clear. We don't have a whole lot of uncertainty, at least in the near term, and in the long term, we still are pretty clear where we're going. This is not something that we need to wait and see whether it's going to turn out to be this bad or not.
Yeah, I would just add to that comment, just that, I think there's a growing recognition that not all adaptation can cause its own problems. So there's this idea of maladaptation, that you can, and that's it's like, it depends on what time scale you're thinking about and what risks you're addressing. But that if you address the wrong risks, or you don't think of the right time scale, you could end up causing problems down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll add, for folks who are interested in learning more about, I would say, strategic relocation. I think when you say retreat, you're kind of telling people they've somehow failed and they're surrendering, versus just recognizing the loss of land to nature. But areas of strategic relocation you can see already happening in Alaska, in Louisiana. So there's a community in Louisiana where they took a community relocation approach, where they had folks come together together with some governance and some thinking, some federal funds, and make decisions about the future of their community together. So really, for each community, you're going to see really differing responses depending upon their own histories, their economies, their social development. All these different factors are really going to influence what choices of adaptation people make. And the kind of core feature of any good adaptation plan, or any way to approach, the theme of this conversation, how do you deal with sea level rise, is you don't just get to make a decision and then say, good, done, next problem. It's constant. It's every year, it's every 5 years, you're constantly reevaluating. What makes sense? Am I achieving my goals? We have elections, we have all of these things happening on definitely not decadal timescales. And so when we think about adaptation over time, it's really about how are we constantly improving? How are we constantly improving our understanding of the science, but also improving our understanding of what's possible in terms of adaptation? And in some places that are highly, highly developed, the most likely response is still going to be coastal protection, because there's already been billions poured into these areas in transit, in education, in infrastructure, that, you go tell someone that, we're not going to protect this and see what they say. I think that conversation is not mature in very developed areas. The idea that moving away from the threat versus protecting against the threat makes sense in some ways because it's very cost effective to protect against the threat, given how much investment that's already happened. So these conversations are constantly evolving, but you'll see them happening at the extremes like Alaska and Louisiana. And then you'll see them happening in lower density areas or lower income areas based upon how the federal government does cost benefit analysis. They tend to focus on areas that are higher value in terms of real estate value, which tends to mean that you can't protect some of those areas, which is obviously a challenge. So you'll see it slowly cascade through those cycles to eventually get to considerations in other areas of the country.
But I guess I just want to follow up on Courtney's question. I mean, but so you look at the seaport, and we could have a whole nother conversation about the seaport and how that got there, and now you need to protect the seaport. But perhaps, going forward, the city should maybe not have another seaport. And for those who are not in Boston, the seaport is a very low-lying area that over the last decade or so has been built up at astonishing speed, I'd say, with a lot of large buildings and very high-end condominiums and things like that. Is that a good description of the seaport for people? And is it in a very flood-prone area? So I guess, I mean, is the city thinking about, not, instead of doing that again and protecting against it, of just, maybe putting a pause on that? And what was the word you used for managed retreat? You had another word for it. But
relocation.
Relocation, right. So, and are there areas that the city is starting to think about relocation for, Sanjay? And then I won't put you on the spot anymore.
No, this is a good conversation to have, because this is the conversation every city is having right now. But so there's parts of Boston, in the Neponset, for instance, there's an area where there's 6 to 8 structures where people live and have been living for a while, where to build flood protection there, to raise the coastal edge, it might harm the marsh's ability to migrate over time, but it also is hard to cost out. And ultimately, some of these structures may need to be rebuilt in 30 years anyway. So I think you can look to examples, not that this is happening in Boston, but for those that are curious, there's policies like New Jersey's Blue Acres program. And Blue Acres looks at repetitive loss properties. So FEMA has a program where, if a structure gets hit over and over and over again in a flood, they're like, why are we paying out every year? Why don't we buy the place, make sure they're in a safer place, and then turn it into open space? So sometimes the federal government does that. Sometimes states do that. I haven't seen a lot of cities do it yet. But to the question of development and the city of Boston, development is climate resilience is one part of a broader picture of the broader policy picture of how you run a city. A lot of our low-lying areas would need to be protected regardless, because train tracks run along the low-lying area. And if you want to have a blue line, right, you might need to protect that area regardless. And so, the questions of raising the coastal edge are not just about buildings, but it's about maintaining our public transportation system, or our transportation system in general. And so you don't have a lot of choices in a place that's as heavily developed to have the relocation conversation, because there's such interdependency and interconnection of these systems. You would have to actually, almost in an academic sense, rethink the entire city to make room for that, which is why this conversation tends to happen more in an academic space or in a design school or planning school, because the realities of once you're trying to build these things, and once people expect that if I get on the road, I shouldn't be driving through water, all of a sudden you're protecting the whole city. So I think the, in the long term, 200 years from now, if we don't have climate change under control, we'll have so many more issues than, is there a building being protected when we could have moved it somewhere else? I think I think where we're at in the conversation is making sure that everyone knows that we have opportunities to protect the city of Boston. They're costly and complicated, but they're doable, and we're doing them. And it's incredibly urgent to make sure that we're delivering on climate action when it comes to reducing our emissions. Because if a city as sophisticated as Boston, it's going to be so complex to get this done. It's something Boston can do, but it's very complex. Think about cities that are lower capacity, or think about cities, that may have unstable governments. My grandparents were refugees. They relocated during a crisis, the Indian partition. My dad was born in a refugee camp. I think that is an example of what Paul raised earlier, this kind of unplanned, chaotic relocation of people. And so regardless of whatever happens in the climate crisis, the one thing we have to do right is make sure when real transformative change is mandatory, is necessary, we don't leave it until the last minute. We do it in a planned manner, in a thoughtful manner. And I think that's the nuance that climate folks get, because we have to think on like 20, 30, 50, 100-year terms, but that's not how cities aren't running at like 100-year cycles, right? We're working with the city we have. And so Boston is a leader on this. It's doing incredible work in this space, and has been long before I got here. And Paul has been a key part as an academic partner in providing the city with really great data, and partnering on and being a thought partner in this work. But yeah, long response, but just to say, it's something you always revisit. The question of adaptation is never a solved issue.
Okay, thank you. All right, so for our audience members, we already have a ton of questions pouring in. So it looks people have figured out how to ask questions, but there's an email address and a way to put questions under the YouTube picture if people want to ask additional questions. But we will go to some of these. Let's see what we got here. Okay, here's an interesting one. What are some things that affect, let's see, how does sea level rise affect wildlife, both on land and in the ocean? Anybody have any answers to that one? Wildlife. Everyone's like wildlife question. People are nodding. They've heard of wildlife and sea level rise. It's a thing.
Well, so we were talking a little bit about the coastal squeeze phenomenon. I think one of the clearest pieces of sea level rise is, what if your marshes or your beaches need to go backwards and they hit something that makes them not able to go backwards? So there is a lot of resilience in the natural system to sea level rise going up and down, but the combination of sea level rise together with other measures may not be. There are other major issues, I would say, from climate change on coastal ecosystems that also people should think about. One of them is, there are heat waves in the air. There are also heat waves in the ocean. So marine heat waves can be extremely toxic to ecosystems. Ocean acidification, we're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. A lot of it also ends up in the ocean. That's making the oceans more acidic, and particularly shelled creatures, our favorites, lobsters and crabs and things. Their shells actually get weaker under those conditions, and they are less able to defend themselves from predators. So major ecosystem impacts are expected in the oceans all around, with coral reefs being by far the most at risk ecosystem, probably under any measure of climate change.
There's also a secondary ecosystem question that has come up that I wonder if somebody could talk to, which is when flooding sort of hits things like oil tanks or whatever, Superfund sites, other sort of waste disposal sites that causes kind of flooding. And I know that there is some questions about that in the region. Can somebody sort of talk to that as an issue, and what kind of threats those cause, those kind of risks cause?
Well, maybe I can jump in. Currently in East Boston, there's this proposal that the community is fighting against for a substation. And one of the concerns that the community has raised, and for those who don't know, East Boston is an environmental justice community that floods a lot frequently. And also Logan Airport, which is Boston's airport, major airport, is over there, and a lot of jet fuel, diesel is stored in East Boston. So really just lay in the context of how it is an environmental justice community. the community has rallied together to fight against the proposed substation that has been approved. And because those things tend to explode, or it has exploded in other cities, which has been detrimental to human health. So that's one impact when you put a substation in an environmental justice community that's prone to flooding a lot, and they can explode. That's not a desirable effect for the community wants and has been, and that community has been fighting that effort for several years now.
Yeah, there's a number of other issues in the sort of the East Boston, Chelsea Creek area as far as flooding and other sort of not exact like I don't want to say toxic waste, but possible chemical in the water issues that might arise. Yeah. Can anybody else talk about any of these from either Boston or other areas that you've seen?
Well, I was just going to point out that there are many, contaminated sites, close to the coastal area. And obviously they get flooded, they release all these contaminants. Another problem that's going to happen along our shoreline is that as sea level goes up, it's also going to push up the groundwater on the coast. And that's also going to start releasing more contaminants. And also, we're still going to have, we're going to also increase precipitation, more rain and storms in the future. So we're going to have more runoff, more non-point runoff.
Yeah.
Which is going to also, pick up more contaminants and bring it into the coastal zone. So certainly, all of our hazardous waste, brownfield problems are going to get worse under climate change. It's very little that gets better under climate change, how you look at it, unfortunately.
There's got to be something. No,
there is one small thing. There will be fewer cold days in the winter time, and actually in New England, quite a few people die from cold days. So it's not everything, but when on net, it's definitely toward the negative. That's the takeaway.
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Let's see. I'm looking at the question list. This is one. I already know the answer to this one, but I'll let you guys do it. Hold on a second. Okay. I'm in Southern California, not me. This is the audience question. We are in a terrible drought. Why isn't there a way to get water from the east where all the extra water is over to the west? How about you PhD people figure that out? Is there, I hear that question a lot, actually. And I think that's one of the things about climate change. It's like this too much of certain things in the wrong place, right?
Water is just really, really heavy. It's very expensive to move it from place to place unless it wants to go kind of downhill in your direction anyway. California, most of Southern California development has really relied on the rerouting of the Colorado River, and the Colorado River gathers this enormous watershed, and climate change is changing in a way that had actually given trouble for the indigenous peoples of the western part of the United States in the past. It is changing again. We're expecting very long droughts challenging the Colorado River, and Lake Mead is already at the lowest level since the Hoover Dam was built. So I mean, these are big problems, and moving water over great distances is very, very difficult and very expensive. Bottled water isn't the only thing that we need to worry about. It's also growing crops, and crops take a lot more water, a larger fraction of these water resources.
Yeah, I might point out that part of the solution also is going to lie in water reuse and recycling. Their wastewater is an incredibly important resource, and it shouldn't be dumped into the ocean. And some communities in Southern California are actually recharging that into the groundwater and then pumping it out. But it's really just water reuse. And the other thing is obviously water demand management. People should not have green lawns in Southern California, and should not be washing their cars in their driveways. So it is manageable.
Maybe another good example of maladaptation is desalination. So some people say, why don't we just take that salt water and pull the salt out of it and then we'll have fresh water left over. It takes an extraordinary amount of electricity to do that. And where does that electricity come from? It better not come from more fossil fuels, or we're just compounding the problem that we've already got. So that maybe under, future solar powered desalinization kind of thing that starts to be a reality in places like Australia that have really severe drought outlooks. But most places, that's not an easy fix.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Here's another audience question. Are there cues we can take from urban planning and construction strategies employed by ancient civilizations or older civilizations in addressing flooding? Anyone? Come on, ancient civilizations.
No, I was going to say, many of these pre-European settlements, they just lived with nature. They were migratory, and they were nimble, and they lived in an adaptive framework.
Yeah.
And living in an urban area, it's not adaptive, it's not flexible. But these earlier groups were adaptive, flexible, lived with nature, understood the bounds of living with nature. And we have to think more, we have to adopt some of those principles in our adaptation planning now.
Yeah.
Well, if I can jump in, speaking of ancient civilization, I want to pull a story from the Bible real quick. The Noah story, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and they had a really good adaptation strategy. They built an ark, and it fit a lot of animals, and it fit a lot of Noah and his family. And according to the scriptures, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. So maybe preparing to build an ark is a adaptation strategy that could be employed by Homo sapiens in the 21st century that might prove to be effective. So I want to throw an ancient plug in there.
Yeah.
People talk about floating cities. They talk about floating homes. I mean, the Netherlands, they have floating homes in some cases. So it's not out of the realm of possibility.
So also, I don't want to go as far as an arc, but I do want to think about, I wonder if, because there is this sense that some cities are learning to sort of, instead of keeping water out, just saying, we're going to live with the water, right? And I wonder if in Boston, should we start thinking about something like, the blue line? So for people who don't know, the blue line is a line that goes from East Boston into downtown under the harbor. It's very prone to flooding and is in danger, very in danger from sea level rise and inundation over the next coming decades. And do we think about at some point, we should just go back to ferries. We used to have ferries. We should live with the water and not have a blue line anymore. I mean, I guess at what point do we start thinking really outside the box? Maybe not arc outside of the box, but maybe ferries outside the box. I don't know. When do we get there?
We got to keep our options open. A large part of Courtney's thesis was actually the idea of path dependency. And if we take the wrong steps in terms of adaptation, we lead to maladaptation. We have outcomes we didn't really want to have. And so I think one way of dealing with that is to examine all the future options that may be in front of us, and then try to choose the path that's going to give us the most promising options in the future. We don't want to take actions that rule out other possible actions. And it's tricky, but and it's going to require a lot of sophisticated planning and thinking, but that's so much cheaper than spending billions and billions of dollars on sort of unnecessary adaptation. And what's wonderful about Courtney's work is she traced this from the history of Boston from 1630 up to the present. The idea that we've made a lot of bad decisions, and in so doing ruled out a lot of options. And I think we've got to learn from that, and going forward, make sure we don't make bad decisions that rule out a lot of options. The idea of adaptive management, and also the idea of signposts and thresholds. Like, when do we know it's time to take another action? When do we know it's time to switch from the blue line to the blue ferry line? And we've got to think about that. We've got to think about this way. What should we be monitoring so we know when it's time to switch. And the other thing is, not only is the climate changing, but also is our society is changing. The way we work, the way we live, our values are changing. So we also have another source of uncertainty to deal with, not just the climate change. So I think that's why I want to avoid getting locked in. My own philosophy about adaptation. So we want to avoid locked in to a certain approach. We want to remain nimble so we can adjust as we go along, because there's just incredible amount of uncertainty. I mean, we know we're going to have at least the foot of sea level rise by 2050. End of the century, that number could be perhaps 2 or 4 or 7 or 10 feet. We have to make sure we don't get locked into something that's going to rule us, make it impossible for us to deal with those changes.
Courtney, since your work is being touted here, I mean, it's, I guess it's one thing to look back, right, a couple hundred years and say, oh, we should have done this and should have done this. Like, how do you figure out how to do that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to go back and say, hey, couldn't you have added a little more land, just to make it a little higher? But, I also talked to someone, because I looked a lot at the development of the seaport. I looked at the filling of the land, but then I looked at the kind of recent redevelopment, and, and somebody said, I wish we could go back. We all wish we could go back to 2006 and raise the land before all the buildings got put in, and so I do think there are some things we can learn from the decisions that were made in the past, and that the way that we make decisions. And I mean, for one of the issues that Boston struggled with was public and private control of the waterfront, and who was developing it and who controls the land, and is the waterfront public or private? And there's something called the public trust doctrine, which says that we still have interests in that, in the shoreline, and even in filled tidelands that used to be tidal and that now are filled. But a lot of the land was privately developed. And so then later in the 20th century, there was a lot of problems with sort of the port, because suddenly that you had this weird privately developed waterfront that didn't serve a function as a modern port anymore. And so there was a lot of the state trying to take control of things and try to rescue that path dependency. And so I think that thinking about who's going to be driving the adaptation is a good, is it going to be privately funded? Is it going to be privately owned? Is it going to be publicly owned, the waterfront? And will that let us adapt in the future, better? Those are kinds of questions that I think are relevant no matter what, whether you're looking in the past or in the future.
Courtney, that's interesting, because that sort of dovetails one of the questions from the audience too, is what private actors do we see stepping up now? Because everybody always sort of looks at the government, the city government, the state government, the federal government to sort of deal with this, but are there private actors stepping in to sort of deal with this in Boston or the region?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe Sanjay can say more about that. I mean, I think that there has been a lot of that. It's been the problem is then it's sort of parcel by parcel. If you're relying on a developer to add a berm or add a living shoreline or whatever. But I think that is happening. So yeah, but you should speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, we didn't get into the problem we're in today with the government alone, right? There were a lot of hands that created the Boston we have today. But it is, there's a lot of hands that need to be involved in addressing these problems, right? It's not something that a city can solve alone. And so we, partner closely with folks in the development community who see this as an issue, also self-interestedly want to protect their asset. And justify the loans they're taking. Increasingly, the push for the private sector engaging in climate resilience is as much from their creditors as it is from city governments, because creditors are getting increasingly more sophisticated at understanding, if they're going to pay me back over 30 years, will they be solvent in 30 years if they don't protect themselves? And I think that's bringing people to the table, but also I think folks recognize that there's a value that each private owner can bring to the broader conversation in the city. Sometimes it's this one little piece of a broader puzzle. In Dorchester, there's a development that's trying to build one piece of a broader puzzle. In East Boston, some folks have already done it. You know, adaptation is one of those things where you take your partners where you can. Everyone is kind of in the same boat in some ways, even though adaptation is very unequal. And the impacts of climate change are really unequal. In the case of Boston, sometimes you need 50 different parcels to get on the same page when it comes to resilience. And that's incredibly complicated. But it's one of those things that, you know, there's in some worlds, there's like Hong Kong, for instance, maybe there's an alternative where the government owns all the land, right? That's not the case in the US. And collaboration with the private sector is critical because of just how we're structured, and that's important. So I think, you know, you'll see it in every city, right? And the most important thing is making sure that there's no free rides in climate change, right? We're all benefiting from these investments, but it shouldn't be that the government's footing the bill for risk that was taken on by a private actor, right? It cuts both ways, and that's the basis of collaboration there. So there's obviously a lot of work to do in this space, but especially as more and more cities develop the capacity to deliver on adaptation, you're gonna have more and more cities competing for federal funding. And there's only a few buckets that can get you the size of funding that you need for major metropolitan areas. So, you know, there's gonna be a lot of conversations about cost sharing in cities, you know, outside of Boston, that, you know, are kind of necessary to happen, because there's no way there's a federal purse that just opens up and buys out everyone's risk, right? It's something we all have to do together.
Oh, too bad. Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, so I thought maybe each one of you guys would let us have a final thought that you want to leave the audience with. And I was wondering, you know, I feel like these conversations about climate change and sea level rise are always so heavy, and I was wondering if you could think about leaving with a thought, something that makes you feel okay about this, or gives you a little bit of hope about this going forward. And Baylor, why don't we start with you, since I started with you at the beginning? You can start this, and then we'll go through everybody. Final thought that gives you hope.
I think the thing that gives me the most hope is that adaptation is really a natural thing for humans. We're quite good at it. We've been doing it for a long time. And some of these changes, even though they sound scary, they're quite far off in the future. So multiple meters of sea level rise as far in the future away as the founding of the United States was in the past. A lot has changed since then in Boston and everywhere. We have time, and if we cut back our emissions, we're going to have time. It won't get too fast for us, and we'll be ready to adapt.
Great, thanks. Vernon, final thought that gives you hope?
What gives me hope is the power of solidarity. We certainly know that climate change is intersectional, and it affects every aspect of life: foreign policy, jobs, labor, the economy, civil rights. So with that in mind, and it is the greatest existential threat to human civilization, I am hopeful that with this realization that people will come together from various walks of life and want to build social resiliencies. Well, people will come together, climate leaders will come together, racial justice leaders will come together, municipal government leaders will come together, state government leaders will come together, federal leaders will come together, indigenous leaders will come together and recognize our shared humanity and our shared responsibility to protect not only this planet, but to protect our brothers and sisters. And then in order to do that, we must understand that we are in this together. I certainly think that if the pandemic has certainly taught us anything, that globalization is real, and that we're all tied in an inescapable garment of mutuality. What affects one directly affects us all indirectly. So I am convinced, and I am hopeful that we can drop the artificial barriers that divide us. Who lives where, and who lives this, and who drives this, and how much money someone has. We could drop these artificial barriers and we can lean in towards our shared humanity, then we can rise up and face this challenge. We could slow carbon emissions. We can prepare to create a more just and equitable world. And this, I find hope, because I am convinced that when people come together, we've seen it in the civil rights movement, we've seen it in the abolitionist movement, we've seen it in the women's suffrage movement. When people come together with a common goal and a shared vision in mind, there's nothing that we can't do if we do it together.
Geez, the rest of you might be hard to top that one. I don't know. Should we end there, or Courtney, Paul, and Sanjay? Do you want to say any last words, or do you want to?
Well, I was going to say I wasn't too hopeful until I heard Vernon and Baylor. I'm going to stick with that. It was great. Thank you both.
I'm just going to say, I think that, yeah, that's wonderful. I think I would also just say, echo, like, not just about people, but the coast is a dynamic place. It's that's what coastlines are. They change, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month. And so I think that just because, we have kind of tried to manage them in a somewhat inflexible way, and it's caused us some problems. But I think we can adapt to that change. So yeah, I would echo some of the other thoughts about that kind of the hope that we can adapt to this.
Yeah, and I'll add, my hope comes from the outrage of young people who get out there and make it known that they want a planet that's livable, and the elderly folks that email me and say, hey, I'm retired, but I want to help. How can I get involved? Right? From every age group wants to get involved and knows this is critical. But I think the most hope I get is from my colleagues. Climate resilience is like a team sport. It's something that whether you're colleagues in government, colleagues in the media and academia and nonprofits and the private sector, there are so many people who are dedicating their time, their gray hairs, their lack of sleep because they're thinking about sea level rise, to this work that, and they're doing it with good faith, and they're doing it because they really know we can fix this. So it's pretty dismal. Make sure to take care of your mental health. Climate change is one of those things that can just gnaw at you because it's not really solvable by one person. So it's just like, what do I do? What do I do? Make sure to take care of yourself. But you shouldn't think that it's not something we can do, because there's a lot that we have done.
Great, wonderful. Okay, we're at time. Thank you again to our audience for joining us this evening. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists, Baylor Fox-Kemper, Courtney Humphries, Paul Kirshen, Sanjay Seth, did I do it? Whew. And the Reverend Vernon Walker. And thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.